Today's Being You, the second principle. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations points us towards something beyond inherent worth and dignity. It points us to the larger community. It gets at collective responsibility. It reminds us that treating people as human beings is not simply something we do one-on-one, but something that has systemic implications and can inform our entire cultural way of being. Compassion is something that we can easily act on individually. We can demonstrate openness, give people respect, and treat people with kindness on our own. But we need one another to achieve equity and justice. Justice, equity, and compassion are all part of the same package. Just as the second principle overlaps with the first, so it is related to the seventh principle, the interdependent web of all existence. These are the words of Reverend Emily Gage of the Unity Temple in Chicago. Today's opening words are in the order of service. There is no greater disability in society than the inability to see a person as more. Robert M. Hensel. Please rise as you are willing and able to join us for today's affirmation and our opening hymn, number 318.
Sing loudly till the stars have heard. In joy feast on this bounteous word. Our praises call us to explore, till suns shall rise and set no more.
Our transitional words are in the order of service. To most non-disabled people, the idea of becoming disabled is pretty scary. I get it. It's natural to fear the unknown, and it's tough to grapple with the idea that our bodies can change in ways beyond our control. Unfortunately, these fears often translate to stigma against disabled people because it can be challenging to accept that another person's reality may become one's own. This is why we need to have open, honest conversations about disability. We need to reframe these fears and turn them into an understanding of disability as part of the human experience. Emily Ledau. Our speaker today is Kristy Myers. She's going to present a talk about meeting people where they are, how to counter ableism in everyday life. Kristy is the mother of Lincoln and has been the chair of our Board of Trustees, now past chair. She's also headed up our largest and most complicated fundraiser for several years, the yard sale.
My first two memories in life happened when I was 2. In one memory, I am playing in a hospital playroom with my brother Jim and another boy. Jim is silently playing with blocks, and I'm chattering enough for the both of us. We laugh with a thin little boy with an IV in his hand. In the background, my mother is watching us as she's talking to a woman in a uniform who must be a nurse. My mother looks tired but happy. Jim is pale with dark circles under his eyes, but still laughs. This feels familiar, like a frequent routine, even if the setting seems odd in retrospect. The next memory, I am crawling and rolling around all over the floor with a dark-haired teenage girl. She is playing a type of game with me where she rolls or moves and I copy her, and of course add in animal sounds or, at the time, just yelling really loud. Close by is a blonde teenage girl in a wheelchair. What always strikes me about this memory is the joy I feel and the happiness on the teenage girls' faces. Now, to give these memories some context, my brother Jim had a medical condition where he had growths on his throat that grew back after surgeries and impeded his ability to talk. He ended up having 40 throat surgeries and numerous courses of treatment to permanently get rid of the growths before he had even entered kindergarten. This meant that we spent a lot of time in the hospital. My father worked, and my mother took care of us kids full time. Our next-door neighbors had 2 teenage daughters with cerebral palsy, and they both used wheelchairs. I played with them often. It took me decades to realize the gift that these formative memories gave me. These memories helped shape my view of people with disabilities as people. It was my foundation for being anti-ableist. Our first principle talks about acknowledging and treating every person with worth and dignity. But the UU's second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, takes that even further and urges us to apply it to wider communities and systems within our world. I like to think that countering ableism is also very much like the golden rule. We all learn it in kindergarten, right? Treat others as you want to be treated. Teachers explain that kindness is the core of this rule, and it is, but it's also more than that. It's even more than recognizing the worth and dignity of every person. I like to think that the golden rule and our first 2 principles just mean meeting people where they are and accepting them. It's very easy to meet one person and treat them with kindness, especially if it's a person who you understand and feel as if you know, because they can be physically or developmentally similar to you. What's harder is meeting someone whose life experience, appearance, and/or communication method are completely different from yours, and trying to meet them where they are. Why is this so hard? What keeps people without disabilities from truly accepting disability populations and meeting them where they are? Ableism. Ableism is systemic, and it separates people. First of all, let's talk about what it is. Ableism is attitudes, actions, and circumstances that devalue people because they have a disability or are perceived as having a disability. Emily Liddell. This definition is my favorite. It's short, elegant, and to the point. Ableism can affect people with disabilities in several different ways. There's intentional and unintentional ableism. There's ableist language, there's structural and physical accessibility, and what's most pervasive is cultural ableism. Not only do I have family members with disabilities, but I also have a bachelor's degree in education and human services with a specialty in disability populations. The classes I took in college, all my field trials, clinical experiences, were all really helpful in professional settings. But most of the experiences that informed my views on ableism and how not to be ableist came from working with, being friends with, dating, and listening to people with disabilities and what they had to say about living life in an inaccessible world. I was privileged in that the normal ableist structures in our society that keep people with disabilities separated from non-disabled populations weren't present in my early life. In my later life, I chose to work on Easter Seals Camp for 5 summers. I chose to be a paid companion to people with autism. I've also been a part-time live-in caregiver to triplets with cerebral palsy. I worked at a state facility in Illinois for people with severe cognitive and physical disabilities. I've been an educational tutor for children with disabilities and an ABA therapist. I've had experience working and knowing many people with many different kinds of disabilities. Adults and children with spina bifida, cerebral palsy, traumatic brain injury, autism, cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities, vision impairments, deaf and hearing impairments, children with epilepsy, cancer, cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, and sickle cell anemia, adults with multiple sclerosis and HIV/AIDS. Listening and talking to all these different people with such different disabilities illuminated the fact that our world is not accessible for people with disabilities and perpetuates ableism by ignoring a significant portion of the population. Talking to and listening to people with disabilities about their life experiences is not only informative, but it's a simple way to understand their experiences and meet them where they are. How can we do that in a meaningful way? One way to accomplish this is to use respectful language when talking to and about people with disabilities. How many times have you heard someone say the words handicapped or spastic? I've heard it a lot. These words are used by many people on a regular basis, and there are some examples of ableist language. The word handicap has the original definition and connotation of being difficult or an impediment. Spaz or spastic has been co-opted from the word spasticity. Spasticity is used to refer to a tightness of muscles usually associated with cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, traumatic brain injuries, and spinal cord injuries. Using the term spaz or spastic as an insult focuses on shortcomings and it promotes exclusion of those different from people without disabilities. I've also heard people with physical disabilities referred to by their assistive devices, such as wheels or crutches. Using language like this places negative emphasis on how a person with disabilities is different and focuses on dehumanizing them. Ableist language makes the world a more hostile place. Ableist words and language are so pervasive in our society's vocabulary and mindset that avoiding and trying to use alternatives is one way to be anti-ableist. One way to do this is by using person-first language. This means changing the wording of phrases, such as autistic. Instead, say person with autism, unless the person that you're talking to says it's okay to say autistic. In many cases, using the wording where you put the person first is the best thing to do. It's the safest thing to do in any situation. So you would say person with a physical disability or person with a cognitive disability, instead of saying, oh, cognitive disability or disabled, or never say handicapped. That's a very outdated term. There are some segments of the disability population that consider their disability to be an essential part of their identity. Communities like this are most notably the deaf and blind community. These communities consider themselves a separate culture from other disability populations, and it's okay to say deaf person or blind person, effectively identifying them by their disability. Also, a person with a disability shouldn't be defined by their assistive device. So never say, wheelchair person, wheelchair. I've actually been present at a disability populations event where the announcers were calling for all wheelchairs to head over to the field like these inanimate objects had suddenly become sentient and are able to follow orders. The announcer should have said, all people in wheelchairs for the event, please make your way to the field, so that he was treating the group as the people they are instead of being defined by what they need to navigate our world. Their words are never okay for a person without a disability to say about or towards people with disabilities. I gotta take a deep breath because I hate these words and I hate having to say them out loud. But I think it's really important that everybody hears it so you know what they are. These words are considered slurs and are the following: any form of retard or retarded when it's applied to people. Cripple, crippled, crip. Gimp, invalid, mongoloid, and midget. It's also considered rude to refer to anyone with a disability as suffering from or afflicted by their physical disability or any disability they have, a victim of, confined to a wheelchair, wheelchair bound, etc. If it implies that the disability is negative or the person with the disability is negatively impacted by it, then don't say it. I said some of these slurs as a teen because I didn't know better. This came to a head when my second night working on Easter Seals camp during movie night, I said, "That's so retarded." I said it in front of 25 adults with developmental and cognitive disabilities. It's a hard memory for me. Yeah, I ended up saying it in front of 25 adults with developmental and cognitive disabilities. One of the campers cried. And I'll never forget looks of horror, disbelief, and hurt on their faces. It shook me. Thankfully, some fellow counselors, Tennessee and Lego, took me aside and matter-of-factly explained why it was offensive to say that. From that day on, I've always referred to that slur as the R word, and explained to anyone else I hear utter that word as to why it's not okay to use it. So, speaking with people with communication impairments or disabilities can be really intimidating. Here are some tips to make it easier. If a person has a communication board or cards, then position yourself in a way that you can clearly view the board or cards and wait quietly until they're done pointing out or flipping through the message. And this is a little self-serving because my son is actually getting communication cards and might get a communication board. So listen up. It's also acceptable to repeat the word or picture meaning as they touch the picture or the word on the board or show the card to you. If someone is using a communication device, then wait quietly until the message is done being played. Talking during the time it takes to communicate might be tempting, but it's just frustrating for the person trying to communicate. It's rude to interrupt anyone's attempt to communicate, but it's even ruder when it takes more effort or forethought than you might be able to imagine. If you are trying to talk with a deaf person, then make sure that you're in a position where they can see your mouth at all times and use appropriate facial expressions while talking so the meaning of your words is clear. Don't exaggerate your mouth movements, and don't increase your volume when talking. It won't help the conversation at all, and in fact, it may frustrate the person even further. Look at the person. I would also suggest learning greetings and how to fingerspell your name in American Sign Language. Sign language is so neat and so useful. There are many people with disabilities who use it to communicate, and they aren't deaf and they don't have hearing disabilities. Many in the deaf community really appreciate it when someone tries to sign. I was in McDonald's once and saw a deaf man using a picture menu to convey his order. I signed, "Hello, and I have to think about it because it's been so long since I've fingerspelled. I'm Kristy, and it's nice to meet you." We ended up conversing for all of lunch because he was so happy to meet a hearing person who could fingerspell, knew some basic sign, and understood communication etiquette. When there is an interpreter present, it is considered polite to speak directly to the person communicating, not the interpreter. I know it feels weird. You feel like you're leaving somebody out. But really, if you talk directly to the interpreter, not only are you distracting them from their job and their purpose, but you're excluding the person who's communicating with you. Now, if the interpreter enters the conversation, then of course, look at them. Communicating is the #1 way to relate to people and meet them where they are. Now, how can you communicate with someone and understand their point of view when there are many ableist barriers in our society that exclude people with disabilities? Another way to counter ableism is to look at physical structures like buildings, stairs, sidewalks, and think of how it could be changed or adapted to be more accessible to people with disabilities. Many people with physical disabilities are excluded from activities, events, and other social or professional opportunities because there are physical impediments in the way. No matter how hard someone wishes, a person in an electric wheelchair is not going to be able to climb stairs or jump a curb. And suggesting that carrying them up the stairs is really rude, and it could not be possible in some cases depending on the disability that they have. There's this thing called universal design, and it's taught to all architects and is considered best practice in building design and construction, but it often isn't utilized because of costs, and the industry doesn't require it in every state. Universal design is the design of buildings, products, and environments to make them accessible and usable to everybody. A perfect example of this is the design of curb cuts. Curb cuts, or sidewalk ramps, not only make it possible for people with physical disabilities who use wheelchairs, walkers, scooters, or canes to safely walk down, but with the right paint, and some of them even have textured pavement, it signals people with visual impairments that they are entering a roadway, helping make it safer. Everybody also benefits from this. Pedestrians who walk, run, bike, rollerblade, skateboard. If you're pushing a stroller, if you're carrying a hand cart, you benefit from that curb cut. It makes it a lot easier to do those things. A couple of very simple ways that you can help change the physicality, remove that physical barrier. I mean, you can buy extendable aluminum ramps for as little as $250, depending on the size of the ramp. It's a relatively low price to make a building more physically accessible. If there's audio missing from the crosswalks or the elevators, just call up the city and report it. A lot of times they don't know unless somebody tells them that it's not working right. Our building committee has done an excellent job of making our buildings more accessible each year. I mean, John and Bill have, they've done their best to, when we have speakers who can't make it up the stairs, accommodating them, making a space for them that's accessible. And every time that we have cleared out a space or rearranged, they've always kept in mind physical space that might be needed for people with physical disabilities. Next time you're at a restaurant, look around and ask yourself if there are any barriers that would be difficult for a person with any type of physical disability to negotiate. This could include space to maneuver a wheelchair, uneven flooring that could impede somebody using a cane, or not having an accessible bathroom stall available. These types of physical issues exclude people from public meeting spaces and businesses. Many of us live a good portion of our lives online as well. Many websites aren't accessible to those with physical, hearing, or vision disabilities. And it could be because they're coded without voice-to-text capabilities for different elements on the website. They may not have captions that have the option of using the read aloud function. May not be able to resize text on the website, which if you have visual impairment and need larger text, that's a huge issue. Or it could be that it has insufficient contrast, like with the colors on the text. If there's an audio function, then not having it be able to have an adjustable volume. And we've all been been on our phones and sitting there on a website that is not made for a mobile, sitting there trying to push that little keyboard on the website or push that little Pay Now button and can't quite do it because it's not that functional. It's not made for big fingers. That's also another way that there's a barrier. It could contain flashing content at certain patterns or rates that can induce seizures, or not being able to adjust the timeout function on the website. I know that sometimes when I go into my banking app, things time out real fast, and I can't even imagine if I have to work really hard at moving my limbs, and it takes me a little extra time to do that, how frustrating it would be if I had to keep starting over because it timed out. Because it took, from the time I did this, it just timed out. Sure, there's some software to correct these issues, but there's no guarantee that it will work with every website or app, and some of the software isn't even free. If you encounter these things, then email the website owner and explain why this might be a problem and ask them to fix it. I've done this actually on the Sephora website. For a few months, the text on the website were in differing shades of pink, cream, and gray. It was really hard for me to read in a certain light, so I thought it must be a problem for anyone with any vision difficulties. I emailed them 3 times over the course of a month. I ended up chatting with their regional rep, and less than a month later, the text contrasts were changed, and I was finally able to buy my makeup. Event accessibility is a huge issue. It's considered best practice to have sign language interpretation, captioning capabilities, appropriate seating for different disabilities, audio devices available, and separate calm-down spaces available at every event. Typically, sign language interpretation is one of the first accessibility elements to go by the wayside. This happens due to cost and availability. There's been a shortage of sign language interpreters for the last decade as technology and medical intervention regarding hearing disabilities has improved, and universities have downsized or cut ASL interpreter programs. It is acceptable, but not ideal to have captioning available. And I can tell you, as a mom of a child with autism, that most places that host events do not have separate calming areas. In fact, when asked about it, I'm usually told that my child can leave the building. This isn't acceptable because outside the building there may be overwhelming characteristics that prevent a person with disabilities from being able to calm down when they're overwhelmed. There could be traffic, there could be crowds, there could be other events nearby, flashing lights. For my kid, if he even hears a train within 5 miles, he wants to go there. Lincoln is supposed to attend a school orchestra performance this week. We asked about a calm down area, and we're told the hallway was available. If a child with autism is overwhelmed, then a potentially busy hallway with fluorescent lighting and unknown acoustics is not any better than the concert itself. I cannot tell you how many times, how many events we've have chosen not to go to because there was not a calm down area for Lincoln to use. Conversely, we will choose some events or attractions precisely because they have appropriate calm-down areas. We went to SeaWorld with my family last summer, and they say on their website they have a calm-down area. It was being renovated while we were there. So because of the lack of a calm-down area, and they didn't inform us ahead of time on the website, we've made the decision to try to go to Dollywood instead this summer. Dollywood is autism certified. They actually train all of their employees on how to interact with people with different disabilities, especially people with autism. When I or my friends with disabilities have asked about accessibility in the community or events, we hear the same excuses over and over again. These excuses are usually one of the following. It's too expensive. It's too much effort. It'll ruin the look, or it won't look nice enough, it won't go with their aesthetic. There's not enough time. It's not my job. I'm not qualified. People with disabilities don't visit here, they don't shop here, they don't apply for jobs, or attend events here. so why should I make it accessible? What people who make excuses about accessibility are really saying is people with disabilities are unwelcome here. All of the aforementioned excuses place the burden on people with disabilities, instead of taking responsibility for making a space where everybody in a community is able to access their surroundings. What it comes down to is this. Any person with a disability of any age or type of disability should never have to be placed or be forced to place themselves because they are allowed no alternative in a living, learning, or working environment separated from the community. People without disabilities don't tolerate this kind of confinement or exclusion for themselves. People with disabilities shouldn't have to either. People with disabilities sometimes decide for themselves to live, work, or socialize with other disability populations. That's a personal choice. The problem is when segregation is a policy, communicated or just quietly implemented. Whether it's for control, literal removal from society, or most often, just convenience. Physical barriers and blocked opportunities are not unavoidable consequences of having disabilities. They're products of ableist beliefs about disability and the failure to take steps to ensure equal access and opportunity. We know how to fix or significantly lessen most of the practical problems that make life harder for disability populations. If these problems aren't fixed or improved, it's because we've decided not to. It's everyone's job to ask questions about why there aren't people with disabilities in community spaces and how we can fix it so everyone not only benefits, but is welcome. Finally, let's talk about cultural ableism. I could literally talk about this subject for hours, and there are so many different kinds, but I'm just going to cover the main ones that affect everybody in day-to-day. But I would encourage everyone to look up disability rights history and economic policy. Those rabbit holes are fascinating and extremely tangled. There are a series of college courses devoted to the history of people with disabilities and economic policies that have involved. Here's a basic overview of how ableism is perpetrated in our culture. Benevolent ableism is the main component in our culture. Benevolent ableism is an attitude or behavior that's intended to help someone, but that actually reinforces ableist stereotypes. So basically, the helper is more able than a person with disabilities and knows what they need without actually asking. This isn't treating a person as an equal because they are seen as needing help due to a perceived disability. Here I go telling on myself again. So for example, many years ago, I was grocery shopping with my friend Sharon, and I saw a man in a wheelchair slowly and with jerky movements put some groceries in the trunk of a car. I asked if he wanted help, and he said no thank you. I wished him good day and walked away. My friend Sharon started to turn around to help the man regardless of what he had said. She thought that I should have just helped anyway. Well, I pulled her to my car, and I explained to her that not only does he know his capabilities best, but this may be a functional exercise for him, and that forcing that help on him would be robbing him of an opportunity for independence. Another example of this happened recently, and unfortunately, I was the ableist in this instance. A man with physical, hearing, and vision disabilities started attending my gym a couple months ago. When I first talked with him, I offered to help him modify the conditioning and boxing moves. He then politely informed me that he teaches karate classes and knows how to modify his own body. I felt so stupid because I had assumed that I knew how his body worked and what he needed better than I did, or better than he did. Needless to say, he was super gracious in accepting my apology, and we've become casual friends. These are just some of the examples of ways that helping isn't actually helpful. Most of the people with disabilities who have told me similar stories about helpers who have touched their wheelchair without permission or have overly praised them for completing a simple or routine task. They have expressed that it makes them feel segregated and disrespected. So again, keep that golden rule in mind, and when you have the urge to help someone with a disability, ask, and then respect their answer. If you have doubts, think, is this how I'd want to be treated? Inspirational objectification is the most easily identifiable form of ableism in the media. This is the portrayal of people with disabilities as being inspirational to all people on the basis of their circumstances. There's a famous quote attributed by Scott Hamilton that says, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude." That saying is on posters, memes, and is often said to people with disabilities when they're deemed to not have a suitable or inspiring attitude. They just can do. This saying is harmful for several reasons. It dismisses a person's experience in everyday accessibility challenges. It objectifies people with disabilities as just uplifting story meant to motivate people without disabilities to overcome their laziness or perceived inadequacies. Also, this quote plays in the stereotype that if you think positively, then a person will overcome all the challenges their disability brings in our inaccessible world, and they will be magically able. Overcoming a disability suggests that one must function in an expected, or what's considered typical way, in order to be considered valuable to society. That echoes the idea that anyone with a disability who chooses not to follow the same path is being lazy or wasting their potential. Inspirational objectification can be many things, from that story about a prom king taking a person with disabilities to the prom to make them feel special, to that story about a person with disabilities becoming a university valedictorian, to a video of a deaf person hearing for the first time after getting surgical implants. It could also be that local news clip of someone with a prosthetic leg winning a race. The inclusion of people with disabilities in everyday events shouldn't be newsworthy. It shouldn't be clickbait. It should be a common occurrence. This takes away a person's humanity and paints them as fundamentally different from people without disabilities. The person with a disability in these stories are made a display for someone else's purpose or gain. The disability population has a clever term for this. They call it inspiration porn. People without disabilities can oppose this by not clicking, viewing, or sharing these stories, so that they are less likely to become a spectacle, and the content can't be monetized or used for other gain. It's easy for just about anyone to say people with disabilities are equal or aren't less than. Relatively few people would argue otherwise, at least publicly. Ableist ideas and discriminatory actions take place when we have to talk about what particular disability populations deserve, what society may or may not owe them, and what actual value people with disabilities may represent to others. The crux of the matter is that it doesn't matter what any person can or can't do, how productive they are, or how quality of their lives measure up to other people's definition of a life worth living. Their and everyone else's value is inherent, not demonstrated or earned. The last major cultural obstruction that spreads ableism is one that few people without disabilities actually talk about: fear. People fear becoming a person with a disability. According to the CDC, 1 in every 4 Americans, or more accurately, 26% of the population has a disability. The disability population is the one minority you don't have to be born into. You can join this segment of our population at any stage of life. I've met people who have acquired a disability as a result of a degenerative genetic condition, accidents, both mundane and violent, or as a complication from an illness. I've met people who have become a person with a disability from car accidents, drug use, cancer, diabetes, eating lead paint, or being exposed to other harmful toxins, an awful infection from a routine manicure, a routine surgery gone wrong, falling off a bike, being shot or physically attacked, and even rare genetic conditions that manifest past birth and later in life, such as Rett syndrome or Huntington's disease. Just performing what seems like a routine task of living carries risk. It can be terrifying. That's all the more reason to eliminate ableism in our society and try to introduce true inclusiveness and equality for people with disabilities. So here's what you can do. Communicate and listen to people with disabilities. Try to attend events and spaces that are accessible so that you have more opportunities to meet and have meaningful interactions with people with disabilities. Use respectful language at all times. Try not to get defensive if you make a mistake. Try to listen and understand, accept responsibility, or apologize. If you see or hear ableism, then try to do something about it. This may mean calling someone out for ableist language or slurs and explaining why it isn't acceptable. This may mean contacting a business owner to point out an inaccessible element or a barrier. It could mean vocally supporting someone who is experiencing ableism and trying to combat it. If there is a space where anyone with a disability should or could be, then I suggest you ask why they aren't present, or give suggestions to people to improve inclusion. Try not to physically share ableist media. Don't spread that inspiration porn around. Ask yourself how you would want to be treated in any given situation and act accordingly. Keep learning. Always remember that every person has inherent worth and dignity. Getting rid of ableism is going to be a long journey, and everyone has missteps and mistakes, but please keep going. I believe that I can do better, you can do better, and we can do better. People with disabilities are valuable because they are human beings, no less, but also no more. I challenge everyone here to turn our principles into the actions needed to combat ableism, to implement justice for people facing systemic discrimination, and demonstrate compassion for all people. Thank you.
Today's closing hymn is number 317.
We are not our own, earth forms us, human leaves on nature's growing vine, fruit of many generations, seeds of life divine. We are not alone, earth names us, past and present, peoples near and far, family and friends and strangers, show us who we are. Therefore let us make thanksgiving, and with justice willing and aware, give to earth and all things living liturgies of prayer. Let us be a house of welcome, living stone upholding living stone, gladly showing all our neighbors we are not our own.
Our closing words. When you focus on someone's disability, you'll overlook their abilities, beauty, and uniqueness. Once you learn to accept and love them for who they are, you subconsciously learn to love yourself unconditionally. Yvonne Pierre.
May the blessings of love rest upon you. May peace abide with you. May God's presence illuminate your heart now and forevermore.
Go in peace, know that you are loved, and that your life is sacred.